I'm Ava Henderson. For most of my life, I worked as the financial mind behind Henderson Renewables, the company my late husband Michael and I built from nothing. These days, I keep a cuter routine, running a small bookshop in town and letting my son Lucas manage the daily operations. But I still sign off on major accounts. And I still live in the house Michael and I designed together. That house has always been my anchor. Every wall carrying memory. Every room still echoing with his voice. When I rolled my suitcase up the porch last Tuesday evening, I expected the familiar comfort of home. Instead, I opened the door and froze. The warm wood paneling was gone, painted a sterile white. The furniture I had collected over decades had vanished, replaced with sleek glass tables and chrome lamps that didn't belong to me. Standing at the staircase, perfectly groomed, was my daughter-in-law, Sabrina Cole, with a smile that never reached her eyes. She announced her parents would be moving into my house immediately. Before I could even answer, a sharp knock rattled the front door. I turned as uniformed officers stepped onto the porch. They asked for Sabrina Cole by name. In that instant, her face drained of color, and I understood. This night was only the beginning. I stepped inside, the officers still outside with their questions, and the full scope of what Sabrina had done became impossible to ignore. My grandmother's oak chest, the one that had held family photographs for 3 generations, was gone. So was Michael's leather chair where he used to read after long days at the plant. I asked her where my belongings were, my voice steady though my hands shook. With that same polished smile, she told me everything had been donated, that the house felt lighter without all the dust. Before I could respond, Doris and Wayne Cole walked in dragging heavy suitcases, acting as if they owned the place. Sabrina gestured toward the master bedroom upstairs and announced it was theirs now, that I should get comfortable in the guest room. I reminded her this was my home, but she tilted her head and said Lucas had already signed household papers. She added that I should not stress myself with details, especially given my age and memory lapses. Her words landed like a slap. I knew exactly what she was trying to do, erase my claim to my own house and cast doubt on my mind. Then I noticed an invoice on the counter, addressed to Henderson Renewables, from a vendor I had never seen before. Back in my study, I shut the door and pulled the invoice closer. The vendor name read Sunfield Materials LLC. I had reviewed hundreds of contracts in my career, but that company was not one of our suppliers. I logged into the Henderson Renewables portal using my senior credentials, a habit he had never surrendered even after stepping back. Within minutes, patterns emerged that made my stomach tighten. Sunfield had been paid repeatedly for deliveries tied to a residential battery project that didn't exist. The documents showed approvals, digital signatures, and transfer confirmations that looked legitimate at first glance. But when I cross-checked with our warehouse logs, nothing matched. I printed the ledger pages, highlighting each payment. The totals climbed higher than I wanted to believe. $200,000 had been siphoned through that single shell company. Every transaction carried the faint scent of someone who thought I would never look closely again. The arrogance of it burned. I saved digital copies onto an external drive, then locked the printouts in my desk. After years as CFO, I knew how fraud disguised itself in line items and rebates. And I knew this was only the surface. My pulse steadied as I thought through the next step. Whoever built this scheme was confident enough to use company accounts while sitting under my roof. And then Sabrina's voice carried from the hall. She was on the phone, telling Grant Alder to be ready to sign new rebate papers the very next morning. The next morning, I drove straight to the office of Dr. Faynar, Leonard Pike, the physician who had treated our family for decades. He looked surprised to see me so early. But when I mentioned Sabrina's comments about my memory lapses, his expression shifted uncomfortably. He admitted she had recently asked him about the process for declaring an elderly patient unfit to manage finances, pressing him about power of attorney options. I laid a folder on his desk, the same one I had prepared with financial records, reconciled spreadsheets, and my notes. Every line was neat, every figure explained. I reminded him of my years as CFO, the audits I had passed, the company I had balanced through economic downturns. Whatever Sabrina had suggested, my mind was clear, my judgment intact. Dr. Pike reviewed a few pages, and I watched his shoulders sag with realization. He understood he had been maneuvered, that his professional integrity had been used as part of her play. He promised to document our conversation formally, correcting any suggestion that I was in cognitive decline. I left his office with my folder tucked securely under my arm. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed. An internal email flagged that Sabrina intended to present temporary financial authority paperwork to our accounting department on Thursday. That same afternoon, I dialed the direct line to the Economic Crimes Division and asked for Detective Mariah Blake. She agreed to meet me at a small office downtown. Away from Henderson Renewables and the reach of gossip, I carried 2 thick folders under my arm, one with the company's vendor records, the other with the suspicious invoices tied to Sunfield Materials LLC. Detective Blake listened quietly as I laid out the timeline, showing her the chain of approvals, forged signatures, and payments. She asked pointed questions, pressing for detail on warehouse logs, rebate filings, and who held authority for each release of funds. Years of financial oversight had trained me for this moment. I answered calmly, producing ledger pages and annotated spreadsheets. To make the picture unmistakable, I had built a 3-tier comparison. The first aligned contracts, warehouse receipts, and field photos. The second matched bank transfers with actual material purchases. The third traced digital logins and timestamps, mapping them against Sabrina Cole's schedule. Detective Blake's eyes narrowed as she followed the lines I had drawn. By the end, the total stood at $437,000, siphoned into thin air. And in nearly every approval packet, one name appeared: Grant Alder, the city inspector who should have been protecting compliance. I saw the detective's jaw tighten. She promised to pull his records, cross-check his approvals, and begin securing subpoenas. As I gathered my folders, the weight in my chest shifted. This was no longer just me against Sabrina. The system she thought she could manipulate had finally been invited into the fight. That evening, I asked Lucas to meet me at the cafe near the marina, a place where we had shared countless breakfasts when he was young. He arrived tired, already defensive, and bristled when I mentioned the irregularities tied to Sabrina. He reminded me that his wife managed the compliance files, that she had earned his trust, and that my suspicions were becoming a burden on the family. His words stung, but I had come prepared. I slid my phone across the table and pressed play. The screen showed the back entrance of Henderson Renewables, captured by the security camera I had personally installed years earlier. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. Sabrina stepped into the alley, met by Grant Alder, and the two of them embraced before sharing a long kiss. Lucas stared at the screen, his jaw locked, his face drained of color. He muttered that it was private, that whatever their personal problems might be, they had nothing to do with the company. I leaned forward and told him plainly that betrayal in marriage was tangled with betrayal in business, that trust broken in one place would never hold in another. His eyes filled with anger, not at her, but at me, as if I had forced the truth into the open. He whispered that he did not want to destroy the mother of his children. I answered softly that I was not destroying her. I was saving him. And saving them. Detective Mariah Blake moved quickly, By midweek, she arranged an unannounced inspection at Henderson Renewables, pulling warehouse logs, rebate files, and contractor statements. I joined her team in the conference room, my folders stacked neatly at my side. When calls went out to the supposed subcontractors, most numbers rang to voicemail or returned confusion. One man swore he had never heard of Sunfield Materials LLC. The facade was beginning to crumble. While the detective pressed for answers, I logged into our financial dashboard and activated a safeguard I had quietly prepared. Every expenditure above $10,000 now triggered an alert requiring my secondary approval. I knew the setting would frustrate Sabrina, but it was my last remaining right as a senior signatory. Sure enough, Sabrina arrived later that afternoon. Sweeping into the office with a designer bag on her arm and a folder of papers, she announced to the accounting staff that she was finalizing the transition of authority. I smiled politely and told her she would need 2 signatures for any release moving forward. Her eyes narrowed, but she masked it quickly with a practiced laugh, assuring the staff it was a temporary measure. As she left the office, I overheard her voice in the hallway, low and sharp. She was on the phone with Grant Alder, insisting he rush through the next rebate package by Friday, or the entire plan would collapse. I closed my folder and steadied my breath. The net was tightening, and she was the one walking straight into it. 2 days later, Detective Blake called me into a meeting that included someone new. The man introduced himself as Agent Cole Whitman from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. His presence alone told me the case had expanded beyond our town. He opened a file thick with records from other states, each page stamped with names and addresses that looked disturbingly familiar. According to Agent Whitman, Sabrina Cole was not an isolated schemer. She was part of a broader network that targeted family-owned businesses with federal rebates and grant money. In 2 other states, women under different names had married into established families, drained resources through shell companies, and disappeared when the accounts collapsed. Forensic scans had matched Sabrina's fingerprints and biometrics to those aliases. The shock did not end there. Doris and Wayne Cole, the parents she had paraded into my home, they were already wanted for similar schemes. And Grant Alder's signature on our rebate files was only one piece of a pattern that stretched into multiple municipalities. The picture was darker than I had imagined. Agent Whitman leaned forward and asked me to hold steady, to continue acting as if nothing had changed. They wanted Sabrina to believe her plan was still safe. It was the only way to gather enough evidence to shut down the network. That evening, uniformed officers arrived at my door, asking for Sabrina Cole. She turned pale, her polished mask slipping for the first time. I said nothing, only watched as the edges of her carefully built world began to fracture. The arrests came quickly. Within 48 hours, Doris and Wayne Cole were taken into custody on outstanding warrants that stretched back years. Their history of fraudulent ventures finally caught up with them. And this time there would be no quiet settlement or quick escape. Sabrina was pulled in next. The charges listed on the warrant read like a ledger of deceit, falsified permits, fraudulent rebate filings, misrepresentation of medical records, and conspiracy to defraud a federally funded program. She tried to keep her composure as officers led her out of my home, but her confident stride was gone. The neighbors stood silent as squad cars lined the street, watching the woman who had played the role of perfect wife and daughter-in-law being loaded into the back of a cruiser. Grant Alder did not escape either. His office was raided, files seized, and his city badge suspended. Years of overlooked approvals and bribes were suddenly under the microscope. The veneer of authority he had hidden behind was stripped away in a single morning. Yet even in custody, Sabrina's legal team struck back, threatening to challenge my credibility and petition for me to be declared incompetent. They intended to twist the very narrative she had built against me and use it as her shield in court. The fight was far from finished. but the mask had been torn off. In the weeks that followed, the courtroom became my battlefield. Sabrina's attorneys pressed hard, repeating the claim that I was no longer capable of managing my affairs. They waved medical notes she had manipulated and tried to paint me as a woman slipping into confusion. I refused to flinch. "Doctor," Leonard Pike stepped forward with a sworn statement, correcting the record. He admitted Sabrina had steered him toward assumptions that were untrue, and he affirmed in writing that my cognitive health was intact. That testimony struck down the very foundation of her defense. I produced the gold file I had built, piece-by-piece digital login histories showing Sabrina's access, bank records tied to the shell company, spreadsheets matching payments against empty warehouses, and photographs of her with Grant Alder outside our offices. It was meticulous, undeniable, and it told a story no lawyer could spin away. The FBI brought in affidavits from families in 2 other states who had suffered nearly identical schemes. Their sworn accounts revealed the same pattern of marriage, embezzlement, and sudden disappearance, layer by layer. The prosecution locked the puzzle into place until Sabrina's role could not be denied. When the judge reviewed the evidence, the charges escalated. What had started as financial misconduct was now upgraded to federal fraud, conspiracy, and elder exploitation. For the first time since Michael's death, I felt the balance shift. The house, the company, and my name were no longer under her control. The doors she tried to close on me were now locked firmly against her. When the trial ended, the storm inside my family began to settle. Lucas came to me one evening, his voice stripped of defensiveness, his face worn by weeks of shame. He admitted he had ignored the signs, that he had let love for his wife blind him to her deceit. I did not scold him. Instead, I asked him to stand beside me as we repaired the company and the home Michael had entrusted to us. Together, we signed a new governance agreement that placed us as equal partners in Henderson Renewables. Lucas would handle operations, and I would oversee financial oversight, a balance that felt both fair and protective. The company began an internal audit, reclaiming funds from insurers and negotiating with vendors who had been unwittingly tied to Sabrina's fraud. At the house, Ellie and Max rushed through the doorway one Saturday morning, the smell of fresh wood polish and baking bread greeting them. "Grandma, it feels like your house again," Ellie whispered, her arms wrapped tightly around me. For the first time in months, their laughter filled the rooms instead of tension. Weeks later, Agent Whitman called to inform us that Sabrina had been indicted on additional racketeering charges. The weight lifted. Justice was not only served, it was anchored. And in that anchor, our family found its footing once more. When the trial ended, the storm inside my family began to settle. Lucas came to me one evening, his voice stripped of defensiveness, his face worn by weeks of shame. He admitted he had ignored the signs, that he had let love for his wife blind him to her deceit. I did not scold him. Instead, I asked him to stand beside me as we repaired the company and the home Michael had entrusted to us. Together, we signed a new governance agreement that placed us as equal partners in Henderson Renewables. Lucas would handle operations, and I would oversee financial oversight, a balance that felt both fair and protective. The company began an internal audit, reclaiming funds from insurers and negotiating with vendors who had been unwittingly tied to Sabrina's fraud. At the house, Ellie and Max rushed through the doorway one Saturday morning, the smell of fresh wood polish and baking bread greeting them. "Grandma, it feels like your house again," Ellie whispered, her arms wrapped tightly around me. For the first time in months, their laughter filled the rooms instead of tension. Weeks later, Agent Whitman called to inform us that Sabrina had been indicted on additional racketeering charges. The weight lifted. Justice was not only served, it was anchored. And in that anchor, our family found its footing once more. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.